It's a Saturday morning somewhere in Britain, late 1970s. You're 10 years old, pushing open the front door, mum's shouting something about being back for tea, but you're already halfway down the street. A couple of coins jangling in your pocket, maybe enough for a bag of crisps and a sherbet dip. You meet your mates by the park gates. Just bikes, scraped knees, and the rule that you're back before it gets dark. This was everyday childhood in Britain. And here's the sad reality. That kind of childhood no longer exists. The streets stayed the same, but children stopped belonging to them. This is the real story of how British childhood changed after the 1970s. In many British towns and cities, neighbourhoods once functioned as informal safety nets. People recognised one another. Not always by name, but by routine. The man who left for work at the same time every morning. The woman who always stood at her gate in the afternoon. The shopkeeper who noticed when a regular face didn't appear. Children moved through these spaces knowing they were seen, even if no one was directly watching them. This created a kind of background security. You could knock on a door if something went wrong. You could be told off by an adult who wasn't your parent and accept it without question. News travelled fast but quietly. If you misbehaved, chances were it reached home before you did. Authority was shared, and because of that, it carried weight. This system didn't rely on cameras, apps, or formal rules. It relied on familiarity and repetition. People lived locally, worked locally, and stayed put long enough to notice changes. The neighbourhood wasn't just a collection of houses. It was a network. Today, many of those connections have thinned or vanished. People move more often, commute farther, and keep to themselves. Children pass through places rather than belonging to them. In losing that quiet web of recognition, childhood became more isolated, even as supervision increased. The watchful neighbourhood faded, replaced by systems that see more but understand less. For much of the 60s and 70s, freedom was not something children gradually earned. It was simply there from the beginning. Leaving the house did not require negotiation or planning. You stepped outside, and the day belonged to you. There were no phones in pockets, and no expectation that an adult needed to know where you were at every moment. Time was learned by instinct rather than clocks. Hunger meant it was getting late. Streetlights coming on meant it was time to head home. What made this freedom work was not recklessness, but familiarity. Streets were lived in, not passed through. Faces repeated themselves. You knew who lived where, which houses felt safe, which corners to avoid. Adults were nearby without being present. They noticed without hovering. If you scraped a knee or caused trouble, word travelled faster than you did. Accountability existed, just not in written form. This kind of freedom shaped behaviour quietly. Children learned judgment through experience rather than instruction. They learned distance by walking it, confidence by navigating it, and restraint by testing limits and discovering consequences. Mistakes were private and personal, not recorded or replayed. What feels different now is not that children are safer, but that this everyday freedom has thinned out almost completely. Childhood has become managed, monitored, and contained. The independence that once formed naturally has been replaced by systems, schedules, and supervision. For much of the 20th century, the day itself had a natural ending. Shops closed, streets emptied, television stopped broadcasting late at night, even noise seemed to settle. Childhood moved within these limits without anyone needing to explain them. When it got dark, the day was over. When shutters came down and lights went off, you knew time had moved on. There was a shared understanding that things ended and tomorrow would begin again. These endings mattered more than they seemed. They gave shape to the day. Play didn't stretch endlessly because it couldn't. You went home because there was nowhere else to go. Boredom arrived not as a failure, but as a signal that it was time to wind down. Evenings slowed naturally. Families gathered not because they planned to, but because the world outside had gone quiet. Bedtime wasn't negotiated against endless options. Today, those natural endings have largely disappeared. Shops stay open. Screens never switch off. Entertainment flows constantly, without pause or boundary. Time no longer signals itself. In losing those clear endings, childhood lost stability. And growing up happens in a world that no longer knows how to be finished for the night. Before play had designated zones, equipment, and safety surfaces, the street itself filled that role. Roads were quieter, traffic slower, and neighbourhoods more contained. A stretch of pavement could become a racetrack, a football pitch, or a meeting place within minutes. Chalk lines, jump ropes, curbstones, and parked cars were enough. No permission was needed because no one thought to ask. These streets were not designed for children, but they adapted to them. Games paused when a car came through, then resumed without complaint. The environment taught awareness. You learned to listen, to look, to move aside. Play was woven into everyday surroundings rather than separated from them. What mattered most was access. You did not need lifts, bookings, or supervision. You stepped outside and joined whatever was already happening. Ages mixed naturally. Older kids taught rules, younger ones watched and copied. Disputes were handled on the spot, usually loudly and then forgotten. There was no referee beyond the group itself. Today, those same streets are treated as hazards rather than shared spaces. Traffic dominates, play is redirected behind fences, and children are moved from place to place instead of allowed to claim one. In losing the street, something subtle but important disappeared with it. Not just play, but a sense of belonging and independence that once grew naturally out of everyday surroundings. Large parts of childhood once unfolded without structure. There were no packed calendars or tightly managed afternoons. After school and during holidays, time stretched open. You decided what to do by looking around, not by checking a plan. Play began when someone knocked on the door or shouted up from the street. It ended when it naturally ran out. This lack of structure encouraged exploration. You followed interests wherever they led, even if they led nowhere. Long hours were spent doing things that would never be photographed or assessed. Building, wandering, arguing, inventing rules, abandoning them, starting again. The value was in the doing, not the outcome. Boredom played a role, too. With nothing arranged for you, boredom became a prompt rather than a problem. It pushed children to create their own entertainment, negotiate with others, and tolerate discomfort without immediate solutions. In contrast, modern childhood often runs on timetables. Activities are booked, supervised, and measured. Time is divided into slots with clear purposes. What has quietly been lost is not activity itself, but the freedom to drift. Corner shops once sat at the center of everyday life. They weren't destinations, they were part of the rhythm of the day. You passed them on the way to school, stopped in after playing out, or were sent with a few coins and a clear instruction. The shopkeeper often knew what you wanted before you asked, not because of loyalty schemes or data, but because they'd watched you grow up. These places taught small lessons in responsibility and trust. You handled money, spoke to adults, waited your turn, and carried things home without dropping them. The shop was a social space as much as a commercial one. News was exchanged over the counter. Notices were pinned up. Children learned how public life worked by standing in line and being recognized. As larger chains and supermarkets took over, that familiarity faded. Shops became anonymous, faster, and further away. Children stopped being sent out alone. What disappeared was a simple daily interaction that quietly introduced children to the wider world. Responsibility once arrived early and without much discussion. You were trusted with tasks because someone had to do them. Walking a younger sibling home, being sent to the shop, minding the house for an hour. None of it was framed as development or learning. It was just expected. This early responsibility built confidence through repetition. You learned by doing, not by being prepared in advance. Mistakes happened, but they were usually minor and quickly corrected. Over time, trust grew naturally. Adults relied on children in small ways, and children responded by rising to it. Today, responsibility is often delayed and formalized. Tasks are supervised, explained, and sometimes avoided altogether. Children are protected from error as much as from danger. In removing those small, everyday responsibilities, something subtle shifted. Growing up became less about participation and more about preparation, leaving fewer chances for children to prove to themselves that they were capable long before anyone told them so. Being outside was once the default state of childhood. You went indoors to eat, sleep, or escape bad weather, but most of the day belonged to the outdoors. Parks, fields, streets, and bits of leftover land all served a purpose. You didn't need fresh air explained to you, you simply followed where the day led. This constant exposure to the outside world taught resilience in quiet ways. You learned how weather felt rather than reading about it. Cold, heat, rain, and wind were experienced directly, not avoided. Scrapes and bruises were part of movement, not signs that something had gone wrong. Nature was not a weekend activity, it was the backdrop to everyday life. Now, outdoor time is often planned, limited, or treated as something to fit in. Screens compete for attention, and safety concerns narrow where children are allowed to go. In making the outdoors optional rather than assumed, childhood has pulled inward. Something essential was lost when being outside stopped being automatic and became another thing to manage. Friendships once grew through constant, casual contact. You saw the same people daily, not because arrangements were made, but because everyone lived nearby. Arguments happened, were resolved and forgotten within the same afternoon. Relationships were shaped by proximity, shared experiences, and time spent together without filters. There was no pressure to present yourself in a certain way. You were known as you were over long stretches of time. Friends saw you bored, angry, excited, and tired. Bonds formed through repetition rather than performance. Today, social life is often mediated through screens and schedules. Friendships can be intense but fragmented, maintained through messages rather than shared space. What's been lost is the ease of everyday connection. When face-to-face contact becomes occasional rather than constant, childhood grows quieter and more isolated. Back in the day, boredom arrived often and without apology. There were long afternoons with nothing obvious to do and no instant way to fill the time. That emptiness wasn't treated as a problem, it was simply part of the day. Out of it came games, stories, inventions, and ideas that existed only for a few hours and then disappeared. With no constant entertainment, children learned to stretch their attention. They made use of whatever was around them. A stick, a ball, a discarded object could become the center of an entire afternoon. Creativity wasn't scheduled or encouraged. It emerged because there was space for it to appear. Today, boredom is usually interrupted before it has a chance to work. Screens, activities, and distractions arrive quickly. In removing boredom, childhood gained stimulation but lost a quiet engine of imagination. The absence of nothing has left less room for something new to form. Risk was once woven into everyday experience, climbing higher than you should, venturing further than planned, testing strength and speed without safety gear. These moments weren't seen as reckless, they were understood as part of learning where limits were. Children discovered danger by brushing up against it, not by being shielded from it entirely. A fall, a scare, or a mistake taught lessons that stuck. Judgment developed through experience rather than instruction. Today, childhood tends to remove risk rather than manage it. Environments are controlled, surfaces softened, and boundaries tightened. In doing so, children are kept safer but also less practiced. The quiet loss is not bravery but confidence. Without small risks, children have fewer chances to understand their own limits before the world eventually tests them anyway. Back then, childhood moved in clear, repeating cycles. The year was marked not by calendars but by feel. Lighter evenings meant staying out later. Winter meant earlier nights, colder hands, and different games. School terms, holidays, and local traditions created a rhythm that everyone shared, and children learned time by living through it. These seasonal shifts shaped behaviour naturally. You adjusted without thinking. Clothes changed, play changed, even moods changed. There was comfort in knowing what came next, because it had always come before. Summer felt earned. Winter felt endured together. Today, many of those seasonal markers are blurred. Indoor life stays largely the same year-round. Artificial light, heating, and screens flatten the experience of time. Childhood still moves forward, but the sense of living within a shared natural rhythm has weakened. In losing that structure, something grounding quietly slipped away. Public spaces once assumed children would be present. Parks, libraries, streets, and town centres were designed for use, not control. Children existed in these spaces without needing justification. They sat on walls, played near shops, lingered in groups, and were tolerated as part of everyday life. Being visible in public taught social awareness. You learned how to behave around strangers, how to navigate shared space, how to be seen without being the focus. Adults might comment or intervene, but children belong there. Now many public spaces are regulated, commercialized, or quietly unwelcoming. Children are directed into specific zones or expected to move along. In narrowing where children are allowed to exist, childhood itself has been pushed to the margins. What was once shared space has become managed space, and children have felt that shift. Life once moved at a pace that allowed childhood to stretch out. Days were not tightly packed or optimized. There was time between things, time that was not filled for you. Walking instead of being driven, waiting instead of being entertained, lingering instead of rushing. Slowness was not a lifestyle choice. It was simply how life operated. This slower rhythm gave experiences room to settle. Conversations drifted. Journeys took longer. Even small tasks carried weight because they took time and attention. Children absorbed this pace without being taught. They learned patience by waiting, endurance by walking, and awareness by noticing what passed them by. Because everything was not immediate, anticipation mattered. Looking forward to something was part of the experience. Holidays, visits, and small treats carried more meaning because they were spaced out. Time felt tangible, not compressed. Today, life has sped up a lot more. Convenience, efficiency, and constant access have tightened the gaps. Childhood now moves quickly from one thing to the next, often without pause. In gaining speed, something was lost. Not productivity, but presence. When life no longer slows down, childhood has fewer moments to sink in. Much of social behaviour was once absorbed rather than explained. Children learned how to act by observing adults, older children, and everyday situations. You watched how people spoke to one another, how disagreements were handled, how respect was shown or withdrawn. Lessons were informal but constant. Correction came from many directions. A look, a comment, a quiet word from someone who wasn't your parent. These moments carried weight because they came from the world itself, not a rule book. You learned consequences through reaction rather than instruction. What was acceptable became clear over time. This kind of learning created social confidence. You understood how to enter a space, how to read a room, how to adjust your behavior without being told. Mistakes were part of the process and usually small enough to recover from quickly. Today, social rules are often formalized, discussed, or mediated. Guidance replaces observation. Adults intervene sooner and more often. While this brings clarity, it also removes trial and error. In losing the chance to learn by doing, childhood became more controlled but less adaptive. For much of the 20th century, childhood was not treated as a problem to solve or a project to optimize. It unfolded at its own pace, largely free from long-term planning or constant evaluation. Children were not asked what they wanted to be, where they were heading, or how each stage would benefit the next. Growing up was understood as something that happened naturally, shaped by time, experience, and gradual exposure to the world rather than deliberate design. Play did not need to lead anywhere. Interest came and went without concern for usefulness or future payoff. A child could be obsessed with something for weeks, abandon it completely, and move on without anyone worrying about consistency or direction. Idleness was tolerated, wandering was accepted. There was an implicit trust that development did not require constant steering. Adults expected children to mature, but they did not rush the process. Each phase of childhood had its own purpose and was allowed to run its course. Awkwardness, restlessness, and confusion were seen as temporary states, not issues to be fixed. There was room to grow unevenly, to lag in one area and surge ahead in another without intervention. In contrast, childhood today is increasingly shaped by forward planning. Milestones are tracked, progress is discussed, and future outcomes are considered early. Childhood has become a preparation for the future rather than just an innocent experience. In managing it so closely, something essential has been lost. When childhood is no longer allowed to unfold on its own, it becomes narrower and more fragile. What aspect of that 70s childhood do you miss the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you learned something new today, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. See you in the next one.